Hello, Rams, and welcome to another episode of Rams History. Today we're going to discuss the Age of Discovery. Alright, now if you take a look at this map here, what you see is the Silk Road. This was probably the most important overland trade route of the ancient world. As you can see, it travels from Asia all the way across China, through Afghanistan, modern-day Iran, into what became the Ottoman Empire, and then across the Mediterranean to Italy, and from thence to Europe. This road was very dangerous. There were lots of opportunities for theft, and of course along the way the goods that were being traded had to go through many different hands. There were an awful lot of middlemen involved in this trade route, and of course every time the goods change hands, the price goes up. So the goods from Asia, particularly things like spices, were tremendously expensive by the time they reached Europe. There was also a seagoing equivalent, what they called the Maritime Silk Road. This was the spice route that traveled from the East Indies through the Indian Ocean and then, of course, across Africa and Arabia into the Mediterranean. And once again, a lot of the same problems. There were issues with piracy. Of course, many different hands trading these goods, raising the price. But the trade in spices particularly was hugely profitable. And spices were rather easy to transport. They were light, small, and, of course, you could make a great deal of money. So there was always a lot of demand for them, and as a result, many traders willing to take the risks. It's hard for us to imagine today. We can go to the supermarket and buy spices, usually for very low prices, but by the time of Renaissance Europe or so, spices from Asia were highly coveted and very much in demand, and they could demand, of course, very high prices. They were used for a variety of purposes, not just simply flavoring food, but many were also believed to have medicinal values as well. So this was the crop that, in many cases, was being traded heavily. Now, the problem here, ladies and gentlemen, is that in 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks. And this, of course, begins to cut off one of those prime trade routes. The Silk Road and things ran through Constantinople. And the Muslims began to either cut off that trade or charge a much higher rate for items that came through their territory. So Europeans now have an incentive to start looking elsewhere for those routes to Asia. Now, speaking of incentives, there were an awful lot of incentives to become an explorer. We can kind of sum those up with the 3 G's: glory, gold, and God. Now, as far as glory goes, think about this. It's been over 500 years now since Columbus discovered America, and everyone knows his name. If that's not celebrity, I don't know what is. In fact, I doubt even Kim Kardashian is going to be able to match that record. Now, besides glory, there was also God. There was this desire to find new souls for the Christian church. There had been a rumor for many, many years around Europe of Prester John. He was believed to be heading a Christian kingdom somewhere in the East. And, of course, many Christians were eager to make contact with him and help him if needed. And, of course, besides God, there was also that desire for gold. And this was not necessarily metallic gold. It could be wealth in the form of spices or other trade goods. But let's not forget that exploration had a major economic incentive behind it. So whether you were seeking to become famous, whether you were seeking to find new souls for the church, or whether you were simply seeking to line your pockets, there were an awful lot of incentives for Europeans to go exploring overseas. Now again, ladies and gentlemen, historical events don't just simply happen in a vacuum. The Age of Discovery, like so many other events, happened because many things sort of came together at the right time. The trade routes through Constantinople had been cut off. Of course, there were incentives in the form of glory, gold, and God. And finally, the other aspect of this puzzle that came together was the technology. European technology had finally caught up with the desire to travel across the oceans. For example, there were some new directional devices, the compass, the astrolabe, which helped navigators to find their latitude, Longitude was much more difficult to find, and it would not be for many, many years that sailors had a reliable way of finding longitude. Better maps. There had been a big improvement in maps through the art of cartography, and of course the development of much more reliable clocks, which helped mariners to understand their speed and their distance. So again, you now have the ability to sort of sail beyond the sight of land and move out into the open ocean. You know, sailors previously liked to stay close to land because they feared getting lost. Some other advances in technology included advances in shipbuilding. Right, the Atlantic Ocean is rough, it's very unforgiving, and you need very strong ships to withstand that. A new type of ship was developed about this time. It was known as the caravel. Right, the caravel was a very small, very powerful ship that could withstand bad weather. And you know some caravels, whether you know it or not. The Nina and the Pinta were caravels. The Santa Maria was not. The Santa Maria is what they call a carrack, but some very famous caravels, and these make it possible for men like Columbus to cross the Atlantic with some degree of safety. Now, the Portuguese really take the lead in the Age of Discovery. Prince Henry the Navigator, right, one of the leading Portuguese sailors, he actually opens a school for sailors to help train them in the arts of sailing. And the Portuguese try to solve the problem of reaching Asia by going around Africa. And at first this takes some time. They have to, you know, sort of continually head down the coast of Africa, making longer and longer voyages, until eventually the Portuguese round the bottom of Africa and discover the Indian Ocean. And then from there they move up the east coast of Africa until finally they make the jump across to India. So the Portuguese essentially, you know, look south for that route to Asia. You can sort of notice this in terms of the Portuguese territory. Notice how they got a lot of colonies and things along the rim of Africa. And of course the Portuguese were also granted Brazil. The Treaty of Tordesillas was decided by the Pope in 1494 and essentially divided these lands between Spain and Portugal. Brazil was on the side of the Portuguese line, and so to this day in Brazil they speak Portuguese instead of Spanish. All right, the Cape of Good Hope was rounded in 1487, and then finally Vasco da Gama reached India in the year 1498. So the Portuguese do get their route to Asia by going around Africa. Now, Columbus and the Spanish had another solution. Their idea was to sail west. The Portuguese generally went south and east. Columbus decides that he can go west. Now, Columbus, of course, was an Italian. I believe he was Genoese, but he was in the employ of Ferdinand and Isabella, who were Spanish. Now, he was sadly mistaken about sailing west. He vastly underestimated the size of the world. However, he does discover the New World. So in a sense, Columbus is famous for finding something he wasn't looking for. All right, of course, Columbus made about 4 voyages to the New World, and he was followed by other explorers. And these explorers sort of were given a collective name of conquistadors. These were conquerors, right? Men who went forward from Spain to try to conquer new territory. And of course, Spain very quickly establishes itself in the New World. For example, Hernan Cortez travels to what is today modern-day Mexico, where he encounters the Aztecs. Now, the Aztecs were fierce warriors. They believed in blood sacrifice to their gods, and, you know, as you can see, they would typically cut out a victim's heart and hold it up to the sun. Now, as a result of their desire for human sacrifice, the Aztecs had made a lot of enemies among the neighboring tribes. So when Cortez arrives, he is at first defeated by the Aztecs, but then he rallies these other native tribes to his side. In some very fierce fighting, Cortez conquers the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan and basically makes Mexico a part of the Spanish Empire. All right, a little bit farther south, Francisco Pizarro does the same with the Incas. He enters from Panama, he moves down the coast of South America, gradually conquering and exploring further and further into the Inca Empire. Now in this, he was actually aided by disease. The Spanish had brought with them many European diseases, including smallpox, and these diseases decimated the Native American population. And this was unintended. The Spanish, I don't think, really wanted to do this, but again, these diseases that they themselves very little understood came with them, and in a sense actually made the job of the Spanish easier by weakening the Indian populations and reducing their numbers. Right. The end result of all this Spanish exploration, as you can see, everything marked in red was eventually a part of the Spanish Empire. And Spain would actually hold on to parts of this empire for a very long time. For example, Cuba did not become independent until after the Spanish-American War in 1898. So parts of this empire would last for quite a while. Now, of course, the Spanish goal is to profit economically from their empire. So at first they develop a system called the encomienda. Now, this was meant to be mutually beneficial. The theory was that the Spanish would protect the Indians, they would care for them, and of course they would Christianize them. In return for this, the Indians were expected to work part-time for the Spanish. The reality was quite different. The encomienda often resulted in slavery, Indians being treated very cruelly, very harshly, many of them dying from disease or malnutrition or abuse. So this encomienda was meant to be a very beneficial system, but in fact for the Native Americans it wound up becoming very harmful. Now, of course, we have to mention the Columbian Exchange. All right, as people move from one continent to another, they bring a lot with them. Now, the Europeans going into the New World brought with them, as we mentioned, a number of diseases against which the Indians had little resistance and which essentially destroyed many Indian populations. They also brought with them new types of animals. Cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, animals that were unknown in the New World before the Age of Discovery. They brought with them many crops. In return, the New World brought with it some crops and things to Europe. For example, tobacco. Smoking was unknown in Europe prior to the Age of Discovery and quickly became a very popular habit. Other crops, such as potatoes, provided a very low-cost form of protein, which actually helped the population of Europe to grow. Perhaps most importantly for Spain, the Spanish brought in billions and billions of dollars in gold and silver, which at first was very positive, but then eventually became negative because all this gold and silver pouring into Spain actually led to inflation and helped prices to rise.